Welcome to How to Interpret Your Bible class. My name is Spencer Conway, and I'm one of the pastors on staff here at Rock Church Halifax. And it's my hope that this would be a resource that would help you in your walk with Jesus and your study of the Bible. So we just wanted to say thank you for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe to our channel so you can stay up to date with all of the new content we're posting every week. But for now, we really hope that you enjoyed this teaching.
Part 2, historical cultural context. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, what we're doing now is we are jumping in to step 1, which we just talked about. Step 1 is grasping the text in their town. And what we're doing is we're focusing in on one important aspect of the first step, grasping the text in their town, which is this idea of historical cultural context. This is one important aspect of studying the text in their town that is going to help you understand what the original audience would have been understanding in these texts. So, to start things off, I want to share something about myself as it relates to the Bible that maybe some of you will relate as well. I'm sure we all probably have a favorite or favorite Bible characters. My favorite Bible character is Paul the Apostle by far. Love Paul the Apostle. And I love Paul the Apostle for a lot of different reasons. I think that his stamp of impact on the church as a whole, the things that he accomplished in his lifetime, the in-depth theological reflection that you see within many of his letters, and I like that, there's some letters that you read and you kind of see the softer side of Paul, and then there's other letters, like Galatians, where he just throws down the hammer and he's got that hard edge to him. And I just think Paul is awesome. But what I want to do to demonstrate the importance of a historical cultural context is I want to read to you a passage from 2 Timothy 4, verses 6 to 8, and he's writing this as he's nearing the end of his life, rather. Listen to what it says. He's writing to Timothy, one of his co-workers, a man that he had been mentoring. He was the pastor of the church in Ephesus. He says this, "For I am already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time of my departure is near. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me one day, and not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing." Now, if you were to continue reading that passage, here's a few things that you would notice, okay? He's concluding his letter to Timothy, and as he concludes it, he repeats a simple message to Timothy. Timothy was his friend, he was a co-worker, and he says this in chapter 4, verse 9. "Do your best to come to me quickly." A few verses later, in chapter 4:21, he says again, "Do your best to get here before winter." Now, this is a perfect example of the type of verse that a lot of us would quickly skim over and not really think much about. But I want to show you, using a couple of these points, how cool, when you start to study the historical cultural context of a text, how the Bible just starts to come alive. Okay? We can tell that Paul wants Timothy to come and visit him, obviously, but only an understanding of the historical cultural context lying behind these words can reveal the depth and emotion of Paul's plea. Most evangelical scholars believe that Timothy is ministering in Ephesus while Paul is imprisoned in Rome. They're hundreds of miles apart. Travel by ship was considered dangerous from mid-September through the end of May and was completely closed down from early November to around early March. Both Paul and Timothy know this, of course, right? If Paul sent the letter of 2 Timothy by Tychicus in the summer, Timothy probably has very little time to make a long journey to Rome. Listen to this. The historical background of this passage, those are just a few historical facts that you can discover through study. It helps us see what Paul is really saying to his young friend. He's saying, you almost get this sense when you take into account all those things. Put things in order in Ephesus and get on a ship as soon as you can. If you don't leave now before winter sets in, the shipping lanes will shut down and you won't arrive in time. Timothy, do your best to get here before they put me to death. Come quickly, my friend, before it's too late. You study the text and you get that kind of a background sense. This is not Timothy or Paul just saying, "Hey, Timothy, I'd love it if you could stop real short for a quick coffee. it'd be nice, kind of. That's how we kind of maybe think about it. Oh, Paul wants a visit, he's been in jail for a while, probably getting lonely. No, like there is so much emotion behind this plea. There are decades of ministry stories, experiences that they've been through, and he is about to die, and he's pleading with his friend and his coworker Timothy, come soon before winter, or else you're not going to be here before it's too late. Okay, so context is key when interpreting the Bible. One of the things that I've said in the youth ministry, and I use it as an example to kind of illustrate why it's so important to study context, historical, cultural context, literary context. Why is it important? It's important for the same reason I will not go see Avengers: The Endgame without seeing Infinity War first. Think about any series of movies that you've ever seen: Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit. The same reason that you probably wouldn't go and see Episode 3 before having seen Episode 1 and Episode 2. That's why context is important, because the fact of the matter is, there's background information that you need to have access to, be aware of, in order to fully grasp and fully understand what is taking place in that movie. And maybe you are the type of person who would say, hey, I don't care, I'll go see Episode 3 before I see Episode 2 and Episode 1. Well, that's fine, but the fact is you're not going to get all of what's going on because you missed Episode 2 and you missed Episode 1. There's a lot of background information that you don't have. Context. Yeah, exactly. Context, I would say, is one of the most important principles, if not the most important principle, when it comes to hermeneutics. For our interpretation of any biblical text to be valid, it must be consistent with the historical, cultural context of that text. If our interpretation would not have made sense back then, we are probably on the wrong track. We must determine what a text meant in their town before we can determine what it means and how we should apply that meaning to our own time and culture. Remember, step 1, grasping the text in their town. Our goal is to understand the historical cultural context of the biblical passage as clearly as possible in order to grasp the meaning of the text. So if you're curious what we're specifically referring to when we talk about historical cultural context, here's a bit of a working definition. This kind of context involves the biblical writer, the biblical audience, and any historical cultural elements touched on by the passage itself. Historical cultural context relates to just about anything outside the text that will help you understand the text itself. Anything outside the text that will help you understand the text itself. So what I want to do is I'm going to kind of touch on those 3 aspects that we mentioned: the biblical author, the biblical audience, and then any other historical cultural elements. Just going to make a few comments on some of these, and then we're going to wrap things up. So first and foremost, the biblical writer. Because God chose to work through human authors as the immediate source of His inspired word, the fact is, the more we know about the author, the better off we're going to be. So here's a few key questions to ask when it comes to studying historical cultural context as it relates to the biblical author. First off, who is the author? Before we even get to what is the writer's background, who is the author? I didn't even write that down. A second question you could ask is, what is the writer's background? So we were talking about Paul the Apostle, just as an example. When you're studying one of Paul's letters, it's helpful to know that before the Lord radically changed his life, he used to get papers from the Jewish high priest authorizing him to imprison Christians. He persecuted the church out of a misdirected zeal to serve God. This explains why the early Christians feared Paul for a time, even after his conversion. You can ask questions like, what time did he write this? When did he write this? What kind of ministry does he have? What is his relationship with the people he addresses? Think about the book of Jonah. What is his relationship to the Ninevites? How would understanding some of the historical cultural elements behind this really terrible relationship between the Assyrians and the Israelites, how is that going to help you understand the really deep message that the book of Jonah, have you ever read the book of Jonah? It will mess you up. I did a teaching on it at Shiloh a couple weeks ago. Holy, it is deep. You should read it. Probably the most important question to ask when it comes to understanding the biblical writer is, why is he writing? What is the purpose behind him writing this book? Answers to these questions will give you insight into the circumstances of the biblical writer, and it'll clarify the meaning of what he has written. A good example that I give that I love is the book of Galatians. I did a study last fall on the book of Galatians, and the purpose behind the book of Galatians is there's a bunch of false teachers that have infiltrated the church, and they're trying to kind of lead the church in Galatia away from the true gospel that we're saved by grace through faith, and they're trying to mix it with the law of the Torah and obeying the commandments, and they're trying to kind of make it like grace plus works type thing. And when you understand that as the background, man, you read the book of Galatians and you hear how angry Paul is about the fact that this false gospel is taking root. Ooh, it starts to give you a little bit of a different opinion. The second thing that you want to take into account, aside from the biblical author, is the biblical audience. Here's some key questions that you can ask when it comes to studying the biblical audience. Who was the biblical audience? Let me give you an example. Mark's gospel. Mark makes a point of emphasizing the cross of Christ and the demands of discipleship throughout his gospel. Many scholars believe that Mark's original audience was the church in the vicinity of Rome, and that Mark was preparing them for the persecution that they would soon face at the hands of Emperor Nero during the mid-60s AD. To encourage these believers to remain faithful in the midst of suffering, Mark stresses how Jesus remained faithful during his time of suffering. You could ask questions like, what were their circumstances? I want to give you another example. When you're studying Jeremiah, for example, it helps to know that his prophetic ministry began around 627 BC and ended a short time after 586 BC. This means that Jeremiah witnessed the revival under King Josiah, the fall of Assyria, the rise of Babylon, the first siege of Jerusalem, and the destruction of his nation in 586 BC. Jeremiah preached against the sins of Judah and predicted the destruction of Jerusalem and the Babylonian exile. We'll just wait until after, okay? Yes. A couple other questions that you can ask. How was their relationship with God? What kind of relationship did they have with each other? And again, answers to these questions will give you insight into the circumstances of the biblical audience and clarify what the text would have meant to them. Other historical cultural elements, key questions to ask. Or actually, let me maybe start off by saying this. When we talk about historical cultural elements, we have a list there of potential elements that you're looking for, but it all depends on what text you're looking at. Those 6 points that we have at the bottom here, it's not like every single passage you look at, you have to try and find something to do with these 6 things. You're really just taking into account your passage, and if you notice that one of these things is kind of mentioned in some way, Jesus in a parable is talking about, in the Good Samaritan, somebody took a journey from Jericho down to Jerusalem. It's like, oh, maybe I should take a look at the geography and the topography, and maybe that'll kind of enlighten my understanding of things. So just putting that out there. But basically, you're just wanting to take into account any other historical cultural elements that are mentioned within the text. And so some of those examples could be, like I said, geography, topography. I gave the example of the Good Samaritan. Just consider the Good Samaritan and how an understanding of these things, when you look at them, changes your understanding of what it means. Jesus starts his parable of the Good Samaritan with the statement, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. So he's referencing geography. You would certainly go down from Jerusalem to Jericho, descending, this is when you look into the topography, from about 2,500 feet above sea level to about 800 feet below sea level. In addition, the trip would not be a walk in the park. The distance is almost 20 miles and would take you through some rugged desert country that offered plenty of hiding places for thieves. Knowing the geography helps us understand how easy it would have been to pass by the dying man and how troublesome it would have been to be a loving neighbor. So this is just an example of how that can help enlighten things. Check out social customs. I love this stuff because it just starts to show you how the biblical world comes alive. Social customs. Check out Ephesians 5:21 to 6:9, where Paul is kind of laying out some of the order that is to be in the home between a husband and a wife, okay? If you're studying this passage, you should know something about Greco-Roman household codes in order to make sense of your passage. Check this out. This is so cool. These rules were developed primarily to instruct the head of the household about how to deal with members of his family. The Apostle Paul uses the household code what am I saying here? The Apostle Paul uses the household code, but he transforms it in powerful ways. Okay, for instance, Greco-Roman codes told husbands to make their wives submit, okay? But they never listed love as a duty of the husband. In Ephesians 5:25, Paul breaks the mold when he instructs husbands to love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So you see, I could give example after example of how understanding the social or religious customs illuminate your understanding. The prodigal son, man. The fact that the father is running to the son when he comes back. Like when you look into the religious and social customs, you realize that the Jewish fathers, that's undignified for them to do that. And all of a sudden, like it's a picture of God's radical love for sinners when they return home. Again, like the Good Samaritan. Jews were like racist towards Samaritans. And so the fact that Jesus is portraying the religious leaders as almost the bad figures in the story, and he's portraying the Samaritan as the Good Samaritan, like it just takes you into a different level of understanding how radical these parables were. You look at religious customs. Think about the book of Ruth and the kinsman redeemer. If you don't have kind of like a basic background understanding of what the kinsman redeemer was in the Jewish society, you're going to have a really hard time understanding what the heck they're talking about in the book of Ruth, because that's like the thrust of what's going on between Boaz and Ruth and Naomi. Economic elements, political elements. I mean, I could go on. In the book of Acts, there's economic things that are mentioned, as the girl who is demon-possessed. After the demon goes, there's an economic aspect to that. So like understanding like some of the economic things in that day and age. And then afterwards, because they're wrongfully beaten in public, there's a political aspect to this, because the people who put them in jail, they realize, oh crap, we kind of broke the law, right? And so Paul knows the law, and he calls them out on it, and he says, no, you're going to escort us out of town. And you got to look into this for yourself. I'm kind of just giving these overviews. But the point that I'm trying to make is, in any given passage, you're going to find different historical, cultural elements that you just want to take note of. And as you kind of just, peel it open a little bit, all of a sudden it's like, boom. Oh, it's so cool. Now, with all that being said, no worries. I want to say just a quick thing on this. There are some dangers that you need to be aware of that are associated with studying background. Number one, you want to watch out for inaccurate background information. Just like studying for a paper in school, your teachers teach you that you need to learn how to find good sources. Well, you need to be aware of that. There's good and there's bad sources. Number two, you don't want to get to a place where you're elevating the importance of the background information above the actual meaning of the text. That shouldn't be like it's complementary. It's not the main thing. It's complementing our focus, which is on the text. And thirdly, we want to make sure that we don't just evolve into nothing more than a walking database of ancient facts, because that's going to produce pride in us. Like, oh, did you? It's like, that's all great, but that's not the point. The point is not to just memorize a bunch of ancient facts. It's all supposed to be back into the meaning of the text. But with that being said, by far, the greatest danger is assuming that we don't need to know any background information to understand the Bible. That's the greatest danger. So understand that it's important. Historical, cultural context is important. And with that being said, we will conclude the night